There's a conversation happening at dinner tables across America that nobody quite knows how to finish. The one where your son or daughter tells you they've been outbid on another house and you don't have an answer for them because the explanation you keep hearing doesn't quite add up. You've heard the explanations. Greedy corporations buying up the neighborhoods, not enough land, zoning laws, NIMBYs blocking new construction, maybe some combination of all of them. And none of them are entirely wrong. But none of them explain the scale of what happened. None of them explain the timing. None of them explain why a house that cost 3 times an average salary in 1995 now costs 8 times that in the same city on the same street. There's something missing from that explanation. And by the end of this, you're going to know exactly what it is, with the evidence, the mechanism, and the name of the economist who described how it would work 45 years before it happened. That's not a figure of speech. The framework existed before the crisis. The question nobody has answered is why we ignored it. Let's start with the story you've been told, because it's not entirely false. It's just incomplete in a way that matters. The version you hear most on the news, and increasingly in politics, goes roughly like this. Hedge funds and corporate landlords. Companies like BlackRock, Invitation Homes, companies with names that sound like supervillains, swooped into the housing market after 2008, bought up tens of thousands of homes, and transformed what used to be neighborhoods into investment portfolios. Working families were outbid not by other families, but by algorithms and institutional money. The American dream was purchased wholesale by people who already had more than enough. It's a compelling story. It has a clear villain, and it is, by the data, almost entirely wrong. Not in spirit, but in scale. Here is what the research actually shows. Institutional investors, all of them combined, every hedge fund, every corporate landlord, every real estate investment trust, owns somewhere between 1 and 3% of the single-family housing stock in the United States. 1 to 3% in the markets where they're most active. Atlanta, Phoenix, parts of the Sun Belt. That number climbs to maybe 5 or 6%, which is not nothing. But it is nowhere near enough to explain a price-to-income ratio that has hit historic highs in cities where institutional investors barely operate at all. Minneapolis, Boise, Columbus, Salt Lake City. No BlackRock warehouse in sight. And still, working families can't afford a starter home. So if it's not corporate landlords, what is it? The supply argument is closer to the truth. Yes, we haven't built enough housing. Yes, zoning restrictions in desirable cities have constrained the inventory. That is real. But here is where the timing breaks down. Zoning laws in San Francisco didn't get dramatically tighter between 2012 and 2022. The rules didn't suddenly change. What changed sharply, measurably, in a specific policy window was something else entirely. That's the question this video exists to answer. And the answer requires going back to a book published in 1963. Milton Friedman spent most of his professional life trying to explain one thing that nobody in power wanted to hear: that inflation is not a mysterious force, not an act of nature, not an inevitable feature of a growing economy. It is a policy choice. It is always, in the end, a decision made by the people who control the money supply. He put it as plainly as anyone ever has. Inflation, he wrote, is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. That line comes from a program for monetary stability, published in 1960, and he returned to it in Free to Choose 20 years later. Always and everywhere. Not sometimes. Not in certain conditions. Every inflation in every country, in every era, traces back to the same source. More money chasing the same goods. The mechanism is simple enough to explain at a dinner table. When the amount of money in circulation grows faster than the amount of goods and services being produced, each dollar buys a little less. That's inflation. It's not complicated. What is complicated, and what Friedman spent decades documenting, is that the people running the money supply have powerful incentives to expand it anyway, because the short-term benefits land on visible people, and the long-term costs land on everyone, quietly, spread across every price tag in every store. Now here's the part they don't tell you in the standard inflation conversation. Friedman's mechanism, more money chasing the same goods, doesn't raise all prices equally. It doesn't work like a rising tide that lifts all boats at the same rate. It works more like water finding the lowest point. New money flows first and fastest into whatever asset class is most attractive at the moment. And what determines which asset is most attractive? The price of borrowing. That's the piece nobody explains. And that's where the housing story actually begins. When the Federal Reserve cuts interest rates, it makes borrowing cheaper. That sounds abstract until you translate it into human behavior. Cheaper borrowing means a bank will lend you more money for the same monthly payment. And when banks will lend you more money, you can bid more for a house. And when every buyer in the market can suddenly bid more for a house, because every buyer in the market suddenly has access to cheaper credit, prices go up. Not because there are more houses. Not because anyone's values changed. Simply because the price of money changed. This is the credit channel. It's the bridge between the Federal Reserve's interest rate decisions and the price of a 3-bedroom house in Ohio. It doesn't require a villain. It doesn't require a conspiracy. It requires only that you follow the money. Now hold that mechanism in mind and look at what the Federal Reserve actually did. In December of 2008, in the aftermath of the financial crisis, the Fed cut its benchmark interest rate to essentially zero. The federal funds rate, which had been 5.25% in 2006, fell to a range between 0 and 0.25%. And it stayed there. Not for a year. Not for 2 years. It stayed near zero for 7 years, from 2008 to 2015. Then, after a brief and modest increase, the pandemic hit. In March of 2020, the Fed cut rates back to near zero again. And there they stayed until 2022. 14 years, with brief interruption, of the cheapest borrowed money in American history. At the same time, the Fed was doing something else, expanding the money supply directly through a program called quantitative easing. Between 2008 and 2022, the M2 money supply, the broadest measure of money in circulation, roughly doubled. In the 2 years of the pandemic alone, the Fed added more money to the economy than it had in the prior decade combined. More dollars, chasing the same goods. Friedman's mechanism, operating at full speed. Where did all that cheap money go? Here's where the story becomes a chart. And I want you to be able to see this chart in your mind because it tells you everything. Picture 2 lines on a graph, running from 2008 to 2022. The horizontal axis is time. The vertical axis is an index. Both lines start at 100 in 2008. The first line is M2 money supply. It climbs. Steadily at first, then sharply during the pandemic years. By 2022, it has roughly doubled from its starting point. The second line is the Case-Shiller U.S. Home Price Index, the most widely trusted measure of residential real estate prices in America. It dips slightly in 2012, begins a climb, steepens through the late 20-teens, then shoots upward with a trajectory that begins to look almost vertical during the pandemic years. The 2 lines track each other with a correlation that is uncomfortable to look at once you understand what you're seeing. The money supply expands. Home prices follow. There is a lag. Money doesn't flow into real estate instantly, but the relationship holds. When the Fed printed, prices climbed. When the Fed finally raised rates in 2022, the housing market cooled. Not because of zoning reforms, not because corporations sold their portfolios, because the price of money changed. That's the mechanism, not a metaphor, not a political argument, a documented, measurable relationship between Federal Reserve policy decisions and the price of a house. And here is where Friedman comes back, because this mechanism, this exact sequence of cause and effect, was not a surprise to anyone who had read A Monetary History of the United States, published in 1963. Friedman and his co-author Anna Schwartz spent that book demonstrating, with meticulous historical data, that monetary policy, the decisions made by the people who control the money supply, is the single most powerful driver of price behavior in the economy. Not supply and demand in isolation, not corporate behavior. The money supply. By the same reasoning he laid out in Capitalism and Freedom in 1962, Friedman would have looked at a central bank holding rates at zero for 14 years, expanding the money supply at historic rates, and said, follow the money. It will find the most attractive asset, it will bid up the price, and the people who already own that asset will benefit, while the people who are still trying to enter the market will be priced out in direct proportion to how much money was created. The framework is 60 years old. The chart is from last Tuesday. If this kind of clarity, having the argument, having the mechanism, having the evidence, is something you want to be able to bring to more than one conversation, there's a guide in the description below this video called the Friedman Decoder. It's a PDF field manual, 30 arguments, 1 per page, each with the mechanism, the evidence, and the plain English language you'd need to make the case at a dinner table without notes. It was built for exactly the moment you find yourself in. You know something is wrong, and you're tired of losing the argument for lack of precise language. The link is in the description. Now here's the part of the story that most people skip because it's uncomfortable and because it complicates the clean vindication arc. If you are in your 50s, 60s, or 70s and you own your home, the same mechanism that locked your children out of the market made you wealthier on paper. The Fed's near-zero rates and the money supply expansion didn't just raise prices, they redistributed wealth from people who were trying to enter the housing market to people who were already in it. From the young to the established. From the renter to the owner. That's not a political point. It's the arithmetic of what happens when you flood a fixed supply market with cheap credit. The people holding the asset at the moment the money arrives benefit. The people who were planning to buy the asset after the money arrived pay the inflated price. This means the housing crisis is not quite the simple story of workers being robbed by corporations. It's a more uncomfortable story about a policy choice made by unelected technocrats at the Federal Reserve that transferred wealth in a specific direction with specific winners and specific losers without a single vote in Congress. Friedman had a word for this. He called it inflation as taxation without legislation. Not a metaphor, a literal transfer of real purchasing power from one group to another, accomplished through the control of the money supply, with no democratic approval required. He wrote about it in 1962. He was describing monetary policy in general, but the mechanism he described is the one that ran for 14 years right in front of us and produced the chart we are now living inside. And this is where the timeline snaps shut. 2008. The Federal Reserve cuts rates to near zero. They have a reason. The financial crisis is real, the deflationary risk is real. But they hold those rates at near zero, not for the emergency window, but for 7 years. Then the pandemic, and the same lever pulled again. Cheaper and faster this time. The money supply doubles. The credit channel opens wide. 2012. U.S. home prices, which had fallen during the crisis, begin their historic climb. Not because zoning laws changed, not because BlackRock moved in, because cheap money, by Friedman's mechanism, found the most reliable hard asset in the American economy, residential real estate, and bid it up. 2022. The price-to-income ratio for American homes hits its highest recorded level. A median-priced home now costs roughly 8 times the median household income, compared to roughly 3 times in the mid-1990s. The Federal Reserve belatedly begins raising rates. Home prices, for the first time in a decade, plateau. 2024. Your son or daughter has been outbid on another house. They're not losing to a corporation. They're losing to the price level that was set while rates were near zero. A price level that, even as rates have risen, has not fully corrected, because sellers who bought at lower prices see no reason to discount into a normalized market. The framework that explains this was published in 1962 and 1963. The policy decisions were made between 2008 and 2022. Nobody can claim they didn't know the mechanism. That's not a conspiracy. That's something worse. It's predictable, and it was predicted, and we did it anyway. Here is the honest complexity. Because this channel doesn't deal in simple stories. Friedman believed in the free market. He believed deeply that voluntary exchange and price signals, left unmanipulated, do a better job of allocating resources than any central authority. But he was also a realist about the institutions we actually have. He wasn't naive about the Federal Reserve. He had watched it in the 1930s contract the money supply at exactly the wrong moment and turn a recession into the Great Depression, a conclusion he documented in a monetary history with such thoroughness that it eventually became the Federal Reserve's own official history of that period. His prescription was not to abolish the Fed tomorrow. It was to bind it to a rule, a steady, predictable expansion of the money supply, not subject to the discretion of the current committee chair. No booms, no busts. No 14-year experiment with near-zero rates. A rule, because discretion, however well-intentioned, produces cycles of expansion and contraction that ordinary people pay for with the purchasing power of their savings and the price of the homes they were planning to buy. He argued this in 1960. The Fed ignored it. The housing market of 2022 is, in part, the cost of that ignored argument. There's one more thing worth sitting with, because it's the question this video can't fully answer. The people who made these decisions were not stupid. They had access to the same historical record. They had read a monetary history. When Ben Bernanke, as chair of the Federal Reserve, gave his famous 2002 speech honoring Friedman's 90th birthday, he concluded it with these words. Regarding the Great Depression, "You're right. We did it. We're very sorry. But thanks to you, we won't do it again." Bernanke was referring to the monetary contraction of the 1930s. He was promising that the Fed would not repeat the mistake of pulling money out of a struggling economy, and he kept that promise aggressively. Rates to zero. Quantitative easing. The money supply expanded at a pace Friedman himself might have found alarming. The question is whether avoiding one Friedman lesson required ignoring another one. Whether the cure for the Depression's monetary contraction was calibrated too aggressively, and whether the people making those decisions understood or chose not to examine too closely who would pay the price. The incentives of the people running the money supply don't disappear because they are credentialed and well-meaning. That's the lesson Friedman kept returning to. In book after book, in testimony after testimony, judge by the results, not the intentions. The results are in. The record is clear. The real question isn't whether Friedman was right. At this point, the chart makes that argument for itself. The real question is why we keep needing to relearn it. Why each generation has to rediscover, through lived experience, the mechanism that was documented in plain English before they were born. Why inflation is a policy choice remains a controversial statement in a country that has now lived through the consequences twice in living memory. That's not a question with a comfortable answer, but it is, at least, the right question. And now you can ask it, with the evidence, with the mechanism, and with the name of the economist who saw it coming. Tell me the one government program you watched fail in slow motion, and when you first realized it wasn't going to work.